Welcome back to the HallOfSportz podcast, and we're back for another episode of the Rugby Room. We just had a few technical difficulties there, Jeff, but that won't stop us from talking about this weekend and last weekend of the Six Nations. How are you doing today, Jeff?
All good. Yeah, no, always looking forward to talk about any kind of rugby, but Six Nations in particular. So I picked a good week to come on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get started with that anyway. And what we'll start with is kind of a quick overview of kind of your initial thoughts after watching all three games kind of the first round of the Six Nations. So what were some of when you're just thinking back of those three games, what kind of comes to mind?
Well, it was there was a lot of expected and a lot of unexpected from the first round. I think that was the key. A lot of the top players did exactly what we expect them to do throughout, and it produced a kind of a mixed set of results that gave us loads to talk about afterwards. I mean, for the first game with Italy and France, we knew that Italy were always struggling to get off that wooden spoon, and we knew that France had this resurgence and stuff, and like there's just the way France played was just they've always had individual players. They've always had star players going all the way down the years. You can pick any year going back that you could always pick 3 or 4 players on their team that could make anyone's team in the world, but it was just a question of can they play together, and this has been their problem over the past few years. But now they've got players like Dupont and Dulin and Olivan and Ntamak, though he wasn't playing. But it's that they're playing together, and you could see that in this display. Now they racked up 50 points. Of course, Italy were poor. They had their problems, a lot of tackling issues and all that kind of stuff. Loads of broken play, but it was the way they handled that really stood out on the day. I thought the first try they got, Italy actually started brightly, and with Garbisi they look like they might have a 10 with a bit of flair, and that can bring them on. And he's only young as well, this move started with a break into the French 22. Their center Brex did a strong break in, and then the play broke down. They couldn't get that further. That was the story of the game for them, getting it that far down the field. A couple of times they actually seemed to score, but it was called back. They just couldn't get a foothold in the game in the early stages. But then when France turned it over and there was a bit of broken play, Teddy Thomas, that run of his for that first try, I remember saying at the time on Twitter that it wasn't so much a case of you think there's 2 ways of getting through the opposition, that you can either barge through them or you can step around them. He just seemed to glide. That run, there was, you could see Italians going towards him, but he didn't seem to move. He just kept moving forward, and then he did an offload. When he finally was hit, he knew when to do the offload. And next thing, they're down the end, and Cretin's going over the line for a try, and then just like that, there's a score. And those scores just kept on coming with Dupont pulling the strings. It was just an all-round performance. You can say that Italy were poor, and we'll see how the other nations do against them down the line, and that is true. But it's the way they're playing as a unit. That Stuart Lancaster, great word, cohesion. I think there's a strong sense of them in that. I think my hot take on it is probably that because they're hosting the World Cup in 2023. They want to be strong on that stage. They're coming together. They've got a goal. They're motivated to get ready to show the world how they're playing, and they're really looking good for that. So I mean, after those 3 results, they probably be strong favorites.
Yeah, we were talking beforehand, and we were saying that when you look at all the stats when it comes to the game, you look at the Italians actually played pretty well. When you actually look at the game as in total, like. You go back and you see the scoreline, you see the 7 tries for France, and you would think, oh, it's just this normal France and Italy game. But I think it was actually it was a very enjoyable match to watch. You're seeing the Italians trying to play that kind of free flow rugby where they're trying to attack, but as we mentioned before, is they're doing kind of 9/10 of the work, and then they just can't kind of put it all together when it gets to the important part of the pitch. And I guess that's one of the difficult ones. For me, I think the biggest thing you look at is, and you mentioned him, is Dupont. So getting the player of the tournament last year, and he starts wicked this year as well, because I think he set up all 3 of the first half tries for France. So for me, I think he impressed me most when looking at that game, because you look at some of those French flair players and they've been flying really since the end of the tournament, not even last year, just a couple of months ago now. So what impressed you most when looking at that French team? Is there, because we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but I think anybody who spoke about the Six Nations before it was happening, everybody spoke about England and France. We see France playing really, really well to start off, and England quite flat. So what impressed you most about that French performance?
Well, like I say, it was the way they played as a team together. They were ready, and in those broken play situations in particular, where they were most deadly. I mean that, like like when you talk about Dupont, I mean, I remember back when he first came up, he was playing for Castres, and I remember they played Leinster. I think it was in 2016, and I remember I watched a couple of Castres games before Leinster played them, and then it was Rory Cockett starting for them, so he was the backup to Cockett. But every time I'd watch Castres, 3 or 4 games, you'd see Cockett play, and at the time the top 14 was real stodgy kind of rugby. There wasn't a whole lot of scoring in it and stuff. It wasn't a great kind of rugby to watch, and Cockett was involved in that. But every time I watched him, this kid Dupont was coming on, and he really lit the spark. You could see that he had that kind of that old style French kind of 9.5 playmaker kind of scrum half, and you could see he was going to be that kind of player. And he's just gone on leaps and bounds, and now he's like you say, player of the tournament last year. And on this occasion, like I say, he had loads of space in which to do what he did, but some of those, like that one where he just chucked it over his shoulder, didn't even think about it, wasn't even half a thought, and he'd already done about 2 things in that move anyway, even before that stage. So he's the catalyst, but of course, no man can do it on his own. Jalabert back him up. He'll probably do better when Intimac comes back. And then you've got, the Dulin as well. We don't talk too much about him when you see the likes of Thomas and Dupont doing their thing, but you've got Dulin coming in, joining the line, and just deadly finishes as well. It was just the whole essence of them. And I suppose the key, we'll talk about this later when they play Ireland, because obviously the last thing we want to do is have to play them next, but that's what we've got to do. We're going to have to find a way of restricting that kind of broken play ball, and be more aggressive at the when we meet them in tackles and that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things that you mentioned there is kind of that togetherness of this French team, because for years we always heard on kind of TV and things like that, they would be telling us that, well, it depends what type of France team turn up. But I think we're now seeing a way more consistent team, because they're actually playing together as a team, and that makes them that more dangerous. And it is a bit of a worry when you look at it. And this is a pretty good stat that I looked at, was that for every time that they visited the Italian 22, they're basically averaging 4.2 points, which is a ridiculous amount. Now, obvious that's going to happen when you score 7 tries, but it's the way it happened. They're very clinical with when they actually did score. The one thing is you're still seeing that they're turning over the ball pretty well, so 6 turnovers, and there wasn't that many handling errors in the game. So even for that happening, was really good. But then you look at kind of the Italian side of things, and Italy had 57% possession in the game. The territory was 53 Italy, 47 France. This one is an interesting one, the time of possession. So Italy had the ball in total for 21 minutes and France only 15. Again, if you look at the amount of times that they were in the 22 when they had the ball in hand, Italy, it went to about 4 minutes, France 2. So you're seeing the complete differences here. But yet, I think the difference is you look at France and just how clinical they were against that Italian side. And yes, there'll be opportunities because of the way Italy like to play. But you have to admire just how aggressive that the French were when the chances came that they were taking them. And I guess it's one thing as Irish fans we haven't seen over the past 2 or 3 seasons with Ireland, that we've seen opportunities, but we haven't really taken our chances, while you're seeing the opposite with France. You're seeing that when they have those chances to score, they tend to take them.
Yeah. And I mean, just on Italy's side of things, it was like you say, it was kind of a brave move for them to play that kind of open rugby themselves. It was a high risk plan that they had. They had Garbisi, didn't think twice about a little chip over the top, little things like that. They weren't trying to play it safe at all. And like you say, they didn't get that. They just couldn't get at that final few yards, and that's not a bad thing. But I just wonder with Garbisi, I remember in the Autumn Nations Cup, I was actually, they played really well at times. I thought he worked better with Canna outside him. I thought it was someone who's played a 10 before. It was an experienced head. Brex was good. Well, he's a good running, strong running 12. But I think when Canna was outside Garbisi, it kind of gave him a bit more, he was a lot more settled. And I'm surprised that he was on the bench for this, but it was obviously the way they decided to go. I mean, it's a young squad. They're obviously building for the future themselves, and you got to give them credit for building up this, for playing this kind of high risk rugby, trying to being willing to throw it out. Throw it around. You had Jemana Wani on the wing, making loads of yards. He had a good day in that respect. But like I say, they finish off the try, and then it'd be called back. It was just so frustrating. It was like whenever France did it, it was perfect. Whenever Italy did it, there was just one little thing, a tiny forward pass here and there. And it could have been a different scoreline with just a couple of, that old cliche, fine margins, I suppose. It could have, like you say with the stats, it could have been a hell of a lot closer.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, is the idea of fine margins when it comes to international rugby. We see the difference when we look at some of the club games, that little mistakes aren't always it doesn't really cost you as much. But when you look at the Six Nations, when one person makes that mistake, it really can affect how a game is going. And it's as simple as, like you said, the scoring a try and it being called back. The momentum of that really can shift a game. And I think we did see that, because you looked at that first, I'd say 20 minutes, and Italy were really, really good, that they were very bright. They really took it to France. And it's one thing that I think we haven't seen enough of Italy over the past few seasons do. The unfortunate thing is they played really nice rugby, and yet it was still 50 points to 10. So there are a lot of things that they do need to work on going forward. And that's obvious. But I think the next important one, and again, sticking with what happened on Saturday, was the performance of Scotland and England, because I think this is one of the main talking points, because everybody expected, like I said, England and France coming into it. But I think that was one of the most controlled Scotland performances in a long time. Now, granted, I don't think England were that good in the game. But the one player you look at, and again, it's every single time Scotland play, is Stuart Hogg. I think he was sensational. He's probably one of the best performers of the weekend. Mm-hmm. And he really kind of rallied that team around, because we mentioned it before coming on that we saw both the good and the bad of Finn Russell at the weekend, which you wouldn't have expected if you were talking about a Scotland victory over England. But I think, again, if we look at that team performance, I think Scotland played quite well, but also they left a lot of scores out there on the pitch.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I was watching it, of course, like most people outside England, as always is the case with the Six Nations, I would have been up for Scotland, and I was kind of watching it, kind of relaxed as a fan, hoping Scotland won. But when I'm writing about Ireland for Harpin and Rugby, I usually watch it first as a fan and then watch it again with a critical eye. So if I was watching that game as a Scotland fan to do it properly, I'd probably be very critical. I'd probably write a real critical kind of article about it, because I would just say, well, you know what, the win is great, and it's been decades since they've won at Twickenham, and that's fine, whatever. But for the past few seasons, they've had the players, they've had a result like this in them. And this was, it was nothing that surprised that they could play like that. We knew that they could. It helped them a bit, maybe, that England weren't on their game, but also Scotland made them that way a little bit. And you had Hogg, like you say, he was doing his thing. Some of those punts to find touch were just unreal. But then also he could just turn defense into attack with just a couple of steps. It was just an amazing. I mean, it's almost nailed on 15 for the Lions. Fingers crossed that goes ahead somehow. But when you talk about Finn Russell is the kind of player where maybe it's because he's been in France so long. You never know which one's going to show up, but sometimes both show up, and I think that's what happened here. He when the play was going on, they took the lead. They had the early play, but when it came to getting over the English line, they just didn't seem to be able to. You were wondering, would they ever get there? And this is one of those very rare times when someone who thinks they're an expert like me, and I go on Twitter during the game and say, why don't they do this? Everyone always does that. But on this occasion, I said, why? They when they got to the line, they go phase after phase after phase. And you said, you're doing this against this English defense. And then you've got a man mountain on your wing, a Duhan van der Merwe. It's like, would you not get it to him quickly? So I just did a tweet like that. And then kind of the next 2 or 3 plays, now England did have a man in the bin. Vunipola had gone at this stage, but that's what Russell did. Russell moved it out quickly to him, and he beat 4 Englishmen. He sidestepped daily and ran through 3, including Maro Itoje, and got it over the line. And that was amazing. But then after that, it was sort of the self-implosion again as well. You had that crazy kick out from Russell. Like, what was he thinking? I don't know. You just wonder if he'd gone for the proper tackle, it probably would have been a high tackle. It's like he looked like he was just gonna do something to screw up there somehow as well. And as the game progressed, you looked at the scoreboard and says, England are still in this for all the domination. It just take one score for England to get ahead. And you were kind of in the back of your mind thinking it was kind of inevitable that someone was going to break free. But on England's side of the ball, I don't accept this thing where they say, oh, well, the Saracens players, they didn't have any rugby in their legs. That's not a problem. I mean, you knew that. You knew that was going to happen. There could have been possibly ways of sorting that out. You've got 6 nations. There's no warm-ups. You step up. You got to play from day one. That's how it happens. But they just weren't performing. Even Itoje wasn't great. Ben Young's players that had done well just last autumn. Johnny May, like critical moment of the match, 78th minute, simple enough catch for him in his 22, just spilled it. And things like that happening. It just wasn't the 2020 performances we knew from England. So it was kind of a perfect storm in that regard. But the only thing I'd say about it is great result for Scotland and all. But the way the 6 nations have gone in recent years, if you went forward to the end of the tournament and told me that Scotland were going to finish 4th, just the way this competition happens, I wouldn't be surprised. It's that topsy-turvy, or that England won it. So it's a kind of thing where it's a great result, but for this Scottish team to have gotten here, and it's a result they always had, it's important that they build on it. So we'll see how they do next week. And as for England, well, they've got Italy up next. So
yeah, exactly. I think it was a big performance from Scotland. You mentioned a lot of the key kind of elements. I had that same thought in my mind watching the game. I was like, they're letting England stay in this game for way too long. I was convinced that in the last couple of minutes that one of those typical Johnny May tries was going to come, or something would kind of come out of nowhere where England would get over and just barely get over the line. But to be fair to Scotland, they saw the game out quite well. One of the key moments that I thought they nearly threw it away was on that drop goal towards the end of the game. Like you said, the decision to go for a drop goal, you can see the reasoning behind it because you're close enough to end the game there. But then the problem is, and this is where we see bad Finn Russell come out, is that ball is played way too high and he still tries to do it when he has 2 or 3 players right in his face. At that time, you take the tackle and you regroup. And then by that stage, I'm pretty sure the game, it had already hit 80 by that stage, so that they couldn't have just kicked it out. Personally, when I was watching it, I know there is that idea to go for the drop goal there, but really if you keep it with your pack, you keep it with the forwards and just kind of go in for another ruck. If you get that ball back, you get to kick it out and you win the game anyway. What did you make, first of all, I guess, of the decision to go for the drop goal? And then secondly, like the execution of what Finn Russell actually did there, because they got away with one there. Because if England get that ball back and eventually score, you can only imagine what the reports are going to be like all week about what Scotland did and how they could have blown the perfect chance to beat England. Luckily, they didn't and they won the game. But again, it's an interesting talking point.
Yeah, my thoughts. I tend to be conservative myself in those situations. I'm hoping they will just see the play out. I can definitely see a case, like you said, for going for the drop goal because, like you say, if he gets it, that's 3 points. You deny them the bonus point. They have to get 2 scores. The game's wrapped up. If he misses it, it goes dead. It's a 22 dropout, and they get the ball back. Or if England do get it back, they still have to go from around their own 22. So there's a good case to be made for it. But like you said, the pass was so high, it wasn't on from there. From that moment, it wasn't on, and that's when, like in American sports, they call it the clutch. It's in those situations where you got to have the right thinking, you got to know the right thing to do, and that it's so. I suppose the spectrum of out halves, you got Finn Russell at one end and someone like Ronan O'Gara, safe pair of hands at the other end. He would have known what to do. He probably wouldn't have gone for that drop goal in the first place. But he would have just rumbled through another 100,000 phases. But the decision was kind of made sense. But Finn Russell, you see, the thing about a player like him is that you have to know you're going to get that with him. He is capable of brilliance. He's almost, it's perfect that he's at a French team. He's capable of brilliance at any moment. So, but if you want that brilliance in your team, you got to know there's going to be a couple of brain farts there along the way. I mean, that's just the kind of player he is. It's like Sexton with his grumpiness. If you took away his grumpiness, you don't have the player. It's all in the same package. So that's what you're going to get from him. It was disappointing that he nearly cost himself the game, but luckily, the team was able to buckle down. There's other great performances in there as well. Hamish Watson, he's one of my favorite sevens in the game at the moment. I have no problem seeing him get that 7 jersey for the Lions either. I mean, everyone's saying Hogg is nailed down 15, but Watson is amazingly. I suppose, maybe being at Edinburgh, he's not seen by a wider audience. The Premiership might not see him as often as much, but he puts in an incredible shift. He's the great 7. What I always say about 7, if you come out of a rugby game and you're not bitching about the opposition 7, he hasn't done his job. And he's that perfect kind of player. Plenty of time Leinster have played them, and we're focusing on him after the game. So he had a great game as well. But just overall, it's a result they had in them, and I'm delighted they got it. But if I were them, and I'm sure the likes of Townsend and Hogg or whatever, they're going now, all right, well, listen, that's great. We're delighted with that, but we've got to build on it now. I mean, there'd be no point in doing that if we go lose to Wales at Murrayfield next week. So that's going to be their focus.
Yeah, it's the perfect building block there to get that result against England. It wasn't exactly pretty, but again, it was effective. And like you mentioned there, I think Watson was unbelievable, but it's almost expected at this point with both him and Hogg that anytime you kind of watch them, you expect them to be the standout performers. And the thing is that they do deliver for both their club and internationally. And it's really good to see, because we had a couple of seasons there where Scotland weren't as competitive as they used to be. And now we're starting to see that them being able to put that performance in against England, if they can build on that against Wales, then that Scotland and France game is going to be really, really interesting. And also the Irish and Scottish game, because a lot of the time we've played Scotland over the last couple of years, it's been at the point in the Six Nations where one of the teams has already pretty much been ruled out of winning the championship. So if Ireland can somehow go on and beat France, then that's a pretty interesting matchup coming forward as well. But then I guess the other half of that game is the English performance, because I completely agree with you. I don't think anyone should be able to use the excuse that some of the Saracens players weren't ready for the game, because everybody knew when the Six Nations was happening, if they weren't prepared, well, then I think that's on Eddie Jones to select the players that are, because there's enough talented players in England. We've seen it with Exeter over the last couple of years. You look at the Premiership and there's talent all over it. And if there was players that weren't really ready to play, well, then you do need to make the changes. Like you looked at with Ireland and the fact that Tadhg Furlong didn't start when clearly he wouldn't have been ready because he was there for a year. I think it goes to the selection for England as well. The one thing I wanted to kind of pick up on is, and I think it's a very underrated part of their team, is Sam Underhill not being able to be there. So him getting ruled out, I think it was 2 weeks before the Six Nations started. How big of a loss do you think he is? Because every time I watch England, he's one of those really aggressive players in the rucks that really does make a difference. Because that was one thing I didn't see a lot of from the English team at the weekend. It wasn't as much as they weren't as aggressive as you normally see them.
Oh, definitely. I mean, we've been on our podcast, we've been doing a Lions selector panel since Christmas, and pretty much universally, I've had 6 different people on, and they've been talking about their selection, and almost universally, they've got Curry and Underhill 6 and 7, because it's not even just. And but 2 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about either player. It's like, and the 4 nations are full of impressive back rows as it is, stacked full. These 2 have come out of nowhere, and they're pretty much almost guaranteed to start for the Lions if the tour goes ahead and they're fit. I totally rate Underhill. It's that, but the 2 of them together, they sort of hunt as a pairing. Like one goes for one breakdown and one goes for another. It's like you're never safe on any carry. It's like they make a beeline for it, and they know how to get over the ball. They're just tenacious. And he was definitely missing him. But I think he'd be more disappointed from the performances he got out of the players he did pick. He should be able to, for someone that's got to a World Cup final, won a Six Nations, won that Autumn Nations Cup. They've had so much beat New Zealand, all that success in the past year. If you're gonna crack on and move ahead, you've got to be able to do without some of these players and fill it in when they're necessary. And they were just falling short. But no, definitely Underhill was a big loss.
Yeah, it's a big one, because you even look at England to a certain extent, and most games that you see them play, is they do control and they tend to dominate the game. But when you looked at even just something as simple as the possession, and Scotland to get into the 60s, that doesn't really happen against England a lot of the time, because again, they're very aggressive and they force a lot of turnovers. But we didn't see that against Scotland. We mentioned, look, I think Underhill and Curry, like you said, are 2 of the standout performers over the last couple of seasons, along with Itoje. But even the back line, you didn't see that much. Like, I know there was a lot of people criticizing Farrell as well. Look, I don't think Johnny May had a great game either. We've mentioned some of the mistakes that they made. It was just very uncharacteristic for England. And look, I guess the game coming up against Italy is the perfect way for them to kind of bounce back and kind of get some of those players kind of getting a little bit of momentum, because a performance like that, it was so, I'd say, disappointing for any English fans, because you go in expecting to win, and not only do you not win, but the majority of the players don't perform to the levels that are expected.
Yeah, that's, like I said at the time as I was watching, I wasn't really disappointed. But again, if I was writing about that game as an English fan, I would definitely be picking it to pieces. I'd be saying, listen, you tried putting Farrell back at 10, leaving Ford on the bench. I mean, it was the first time in years he'd done that. You just basically you fixed something that wasn't broken, is what he did with that selection. And he greatly disrespected the Scots in doing it. And they were ready for them, and they paid the price, and they should have lost by more. They were lucky. It was a discipline issues as well. They were giving away penalties after penalties after penalties. How they only got, was it just 1 yellow card? I mean, how that happened, I don't want to start this whole Andrew Brace thing. It's just the different refs see it differently, but I really thought they really should have gotten one in the second half as well. That could have made a big difference as well to the final score. But also, they just couldn't get things going themselves. Now, they had Scotland in their faces as well. Scotland were putting them under pressure. They were getting forcing turnovers as well. But still, you'd be expecting them to settle in more. If he's going to change, he's going to make such big changes in the creative center of the team like that. You'd expect them to have a plan to get the results, and it just wasn't happening. Yeah,
it's an interesting one that you do mention kind of the yellow cards, because I was thinking the same thing watching the game. Because the amount of times I think the English pack were warned about the next penalty and it's a yellow card, and it comes to the next one and it's the same warning again and again.
Donald Trump doesn't get that many last chances.
Exactly. I just find it's very odd that and I don't really like talking about referees because I know they have a really difficult job, but it's the inconsistency. I think if everybody was doing the same thing, I think people would say, oh, that's fair enough. That's just the way it's being reffed. But I guess when you look at different games and you can see how some referees are seeing it, it can be quite disheartening, especially for a Scotland team that had to go through with Finn Russell being yellow carded, but then they probably thought that in the second half England deserved to go down to 14 men and they could have pressed home that advantage. So it would have definitely been a bigger talking point, I think, if England did come back to score and to win that game. But I think when you look at it as an overall kind of matchup in those first two games, the teams that played the best won, and that doesn't always happen. That brings us to the game on Sunday, and this was, I think, this one was kind of full of emotion for me anyway, because you start the game and we hear all these new things that Farrell wants to bring to the Irish attack, and you see James Lowe play for his first Six Nations game, and within 15 or 16 minutes, and the game plan's pretty much out the window with that red card. I guess, first of all, what did you make of it at the time? Do you think that it was...
I was good. In honor of it, I was going to have a bowl of chicken wings here beside me, but then I'd be eating it, so I wouldn't be able to talk. No, listen, before the game, and oftentimes, I am a big Peter O'Mahony fan. You know, obviously when he's playing for Green, maybe not so much for Munster. But so even in my preview for it, I was saying, listen, you know, everyone's talking about our back row, but you can't account for like the experience he brings, the leadership he brings. And I was talking about all that. I was almost setting it up for something like this to happen by saying all that beforehand, because this was really disappointing. When he first came up in Munster and he started playing for Ireland and he started being a captain, he did have this kind of aggression issues kind of thing, and he'd sometimes get too angry with the ref and all this kind of stuff. And this collision, now there was nothing intentional in it. My viewing of it was he was. Sexton had a hold of your man Francis, and when O'Mahony committed to the challenge, he saw Sexton's back and he was kind of aiming at that, but then he put his head down and went like that, and that's just reckless. You can't do that, and when you get there, you're responsible for whatever it is. He met your man's head, he had to go, no question. And of course, that just, as Ireland fans, I mean, you're talking, it's the first game of the Six Nations. There's Grand Slam, Triple Crown on the line, 15 minutes into the game, like you said yourself, and you just think all of that is gone. And what's more, Wales had gotten the first score as well. They were always, we were getting more possession, but we were just having trouble turning it into points. And Wales had taken the lead, and now we're a man down. And then they go 6-0 up, and then we lose James Ryan. I think we lost Ryan before the second penalty, but so we've those two men gone. We've a man less on the pitch. We're 6-0 down, and it's like you're just deflated because you can't see anything happening. But then the rest of the match, it did kind of improve from that point on.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned some of those, and I agree. I think when I looked at the incident, I think it was very unnecessary for O'Mahony to go in the way he did, and you could tell from the start of the game that he was very amped up for it. And personally, I like when Peter O'Mahony is actually very calm and collected, because that's when you actually see him play some of his best rugby, because he gets in, he's able to turn over the ball quite often. But it was one of those that I think he saw at the end of the last Six Nations with the likes of Caelan Doris and Will Connors come in, and he didn't see himself starting as much, gets in, and I think it's one of those that it's a quick decision that he's made, and he probably knew at the time it was what he did was bad, and I think people thought he got away with it at the very start until it went up to the TMO. But absolutely, it was reckless, and it was a red card. And unfortunately for him, that if someone like, I'm assuming that Will Connors probably gets the nod this weekend, if you look at the way it kind of worked out on the bench, that there's other options there. You have Rhys Ruddock who's around. I know they brought in Jack Conan as well. But again, we've mentioned it with the back row. It's tough to get into the Irish back row at the moment, and I think it's the last thing that O'Mahony would have wanted at that point in time. But yeah, I think it was one of those, the way the game started, just it looked like it was one of those days. And then I thought it was a superb try that Ireland scored, and it kind of shifted that momentum. And then it's just that, what was it, 7-8 minutes for Wales to start the second half, and I thought they kind of took the control back of the game. But for the most part, when you looked at it, I think Ireland played quite well, and it was unfortunate that they went down to 14 men, because I think if they didn't, they probably would have won the game based on how they played. So how impressed were you with the kind of performance of the 14-man Ireland team? Because that's really tough in international rugby to go, 66 minutes down a man, and really to have the opportunity to win the game at the end.
Yeah, it was. It's always a challenge, whoever you're playing. But even though we were actually 3-0 down at the time, I still think we had the upper hand. I got the impression up to that point, I was thinking Wales were almost playing like they were the away team. They were kicking it back to us. They weren't. They were getting into the only way they were going to get to score was, through the penalty kicks. They weren't getting too deep into our territory. So you'd hope, in that situation, that maybe if you can just regroup, stick to your game plan, and you might be able to get some headway. And in some ways, if you'd want, in terms of leadership, if there was one player I'd want to be on the pitch when I'm 14 men, in a fight against 15, it would be Peter O'Mahony. But in another sense, he is such his role in the Irish team, he does so many other jobs. Sometimes he'd be out in the wing. Sometimes he'd be scrum half. He's no problem scooping up a pass to someone. He's a good jumper on the line. He does loads of things. He does all that extra things that if he's actually taken out of the equation, the other guys, they've all still got their roles and they're all still important. And if they all knuckle down and do them, and we were getting an edge on them in the scrums, even with the man down. We put Robbie Henshaw in when it was our put in, but when it was the Welsh put in, we keep him back, and they still weren't getting their prop got player of the match, but they still weren't getting any advantage with the extra man in the scrums. But I thought that we settled in. I thought the first half our kicking game was excellent. I thought Sexton's bombs were falling just outside the 22. Murray was finding great touches from his own 22. High balls were going. They were following up. We were gathering back possession. It was all. A lot of people don't like the box kicks. I'm saying if it's working, it can be devastating. And then we built, like you say, that Tyburn try. Just the whole build up to it was really impressive. Robbie Henshaw was just he's been in great form recently. I mean, you talked about, you had a podcast the other week talking about the Leinster-Munster game. He was really influential there. Just comes back from injury and just hits. He's a great crash ball element on 12. But we had other options as well. We had we actually put Robbie Henshaw in the scrum when we had a put in. We were using Gary Ringrose. We were using James Lowe. We had lots of different, and there was a lot of variation. We weren't afraid to put it out the backs. Hugo Keenan was joining the line. There was lots of things happening there. So I was very impressed with how we recovered from that situation. There was adversity, but they got back together, built the lead, 13-6 up at halftime. Could have been more. But just what happened is the second half, obviously, we would have wanted the first half to go on for longer, because that break allowed the Welsh to regroup. Like you say, they did better after the break. But then our decision-making started to go a bit awry. Our kicks, I think the kick radar sort of went off then as well. And then we had it, and all these players that I've been naming that played well, Tyg Byrne, who got the try. Everyone, they had great games, but they all made their own mistakes. We talk about two mistakes in particular from this game, but everyone's kind of shared the blame around in mistakes. Like, for example, even Gary Ringrose, he did a cross ball out of his own 22 from a scrum, which it didn't seem like a bad decision to me at the time. But then I remember, Jesus, we're a man down, and I'd actually forgotten that. It's almost forgotten that. And in the turnover, Wales just went straight ahead and scored. And of course, James Lowe, his tackling was a bit suspect there as well. He should have gone for his man instead of expecting Henderson to get him. But it was just in that moment. And I think it was almost kind of, we've been doing so well since that sending off, we'd almost forgotten that they had the extra man. And it just happened that when we had these turnovers for both of their tries, they had a penalty advantage under the post, and I guarantee you they would have kicked that for 3 points had they gotten it. But instead, they played the advantage, used the extra man, and got their tries, and that was the difference in the end.
Yeah, it's one of those that it's really interesting getting that mindset when you are down to 14, because I was kind of a bit nervous of it at the time, kind of playing out from from inside your own 22, because you do put yourself under pressure if you get isolated, if Wales are able to kind of dominate a little bit in the rucks. And we saw really the 2 tries that Wales scored came from Irish mistakes. And I think that's the biggest thing that needs to be eliminated, because in some of these big games, when we think of this France game coming up, or we think of when we play against England, when you make mistakes, that tends to be when you get punished at international rugby. And especially when you're down to 14 men, you need to play an almost perfect game when that does happen. And I think in the first half, Ireland almost did play a pretty much perfect half there with how they dealt with going down to 14. But I think, as you said, the kicking game got worse, and there was many. It wasn't just on Sexton or on Billy Burns, which everybody kind of talks about. There was a lot of kicks that were completely, that put Ireland on the back foot quite a lot in that second half. And it was one thing that really needs to improve, I think, going forward. I guess one of the key things that we can kind of talk about in just kind of looking forward to the game at the weekend, the two big look, obviously there's the talking point of James Ryan and Jonathan Sexton. If they come back in time, hopefully that does happen. But I guess with Sexton going out, who would you prefer to come in if he wasn't available for the France game? Because I know it was a really unfortunate way to end for Billy Burns' first Six Nations game, and a lot of people were wondering why Ross Byrne wasn't on the bench, considering that he had more experience, especially in such a big game. And now we look at being down to 14, and the mistake, like we said, it's a game of inches. You make that one mistake at the end, and you could see how distraught he was after the game. So if Sexton, let's say he isn't cleared from the concussion protocol when it comes to having to select a team, who would you be going for? Would you be going for Ross Byrne in the more experienced 10, or would you keep your faith in Billy Burns moving forward?
I think personally myself, I wouldn't have had I might have had someone like Ross Byrne, or maybe even Jack Carty backing up Sexton there. But the thing about, and you know, that's nothing really against Billy Burns, but it's just that what he has done for Ulster has been with John Cooney. He's used to playing with him, and I would have been, you know, going into these internationals, like even by September, I would have expected John Cooney to be in the squad as well. And if he was there, if the two of them were there, they'd be great to have on the bench. But now he's gone for Jemison Gibson Park. I think Gibson Park has done really well in his own right. I think he could have been brought on earlier in this game. But going forward, I would probably have Jack Carty. But Farrell strikes me as the kind of coach who nails down his 23 going into a series of matches and sticks with him as much as he can. I'd be surprised if he didn't give Burns, show his faith in Burns. And there's an element to that as well, because it shows, because he had him as his backup. So if he drops him now, it's like everything totally gone from that mistake. I mean, it was a bad mistake. He's gotten some terrible abuse on social media. We've been talking about it ourselves, and that's terrible. But you don't want to be associated with that. You know, you still want to be able to say it was a mistake. I think the best reaction to that was from James Lowe as he did it. James Lowe was right behind him. You know, Lowe he's thinking, I'm going to score the match-winning try here. He's thinking about what he's going to do on the next play. Then he looks and sees it goes, and the first thing he does, he puts his hand to his head, but he's standing right behind Burns. And the next thing he does, he goes over and puts his arm around him. That was the way to deal with that. And I think that maybe Farrell might be thinking, like, you know, listen, this guy was prepared to play. He knows the team system. He knows the setup. He might go with him. Ross Byrne, like I think Brian O'Driscoll said something about bringing up Harry Byrne. It's just like, you know, he's not ready yet. So, you know, hold the horses there. Ross Byrne is definitely a solid option. It changes your game a lot when you have him. Billy Burns is a good running back. I think he would do better with maybe Jefferson Gibson Park if he doesn't have Cooney. You just wonder how the kicking game would progress if he was starting. But that's a lot of things to think of. But I wouldn't give up on him just yet. Anyway, that's the thing. And we'll just see how he goes from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way it depends on what Ireland want to do against France. If they want to play territory, if they want to really use the kicking game, look, I think Ross Byrne's an excellent kind of kicker from his hands, and he's a good goal kicker. And like you said, Burns is probably better on the ball. So it depends on what they want to do against France. Do they want to have that open game? You probably do play Billy Burns. Now, hopefully, we talk about this and that Sexton actually will be able to play for the game, because it'd be good to see him get to go through a full Six Nations again. Same thing for James Ryan. I guess this is just kind of one way to kind of end it, and it's been a really good chat today. Is what would be your prediction for the game against France? I know it's a really tough one because of how well we saw France play, but what would you say for the weekend?
I suppose gun to my head before seeing the predictions, I'd have to go with France. But the key to Ireland is going to be discipline. I mean, we talked about what happened in the Italy game. They were giving them open field possession. I wouldn't expect us to do that as much with them, especially in the first 20 minutes. We've got a good defensive framework. If we can put pressure on them, like you say, it's a lot's going to be down to what he does to replace Peter O'Mahony. He has loads of options there. He can move Tadhg Beirne back to 6. He could stay with the team he had, move Tadhg Beirne. Henderson played well when he came on. He could go into the second row, assuming Ryan's back as well. Loads of options there. But from a team standpoint, it's discipline. We gave away a lot of penalties against Wales. A lot of them were needless, little niggly things, walking in from the side, just simple things that are going to be picked up on. And if we can just keep that focus and not give them easy possession, there's definitely a path that we can win. So, it's play it 20 minutes at a time and get through those phases, still in with the shout of winning. We have enough game breakers in that team to do it. I would predict France if I was actually putting money down on it now. We'll see what the teams look like, but there is definitely a path to victory for Ireland, I'd say.
Absolutely. It's really good to kind of go through this and kind of analyze really what it meant, because I think we mentioned it a few times. My opinion changed in some of the games from watching it the first time to actually then going back and analyzing it again. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on Sunday between France and Ireland, because I have an idea of what I think will happen. But again, we never know. Like we said, one moment can change a game. So I really appreciate you joining me today, Jeff. Before we end, just make sure everybody to like, comment, subscribe to the podcast. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere else you get your podcasts. And Jeff, where can people find your work as well?
Pretty much we're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and we have a podcast as well. But if you go to harpinonrugby.net, I have it there in the box there. harpinonrugby.net, that's the hub for everything we do.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today, Jeff.
No problem, Kieran.